I have been getting in touch with that prophetic anger and rage so well embodied by the Hebrew prophets in the Hebrew scriptures, Jeremiah, Isaiah. And the source of my rage this week is Governor Kemp's order that he gave on Monday, telling all the businesses, that pretty much all the businesses that were closed during this pandemic in Georgia, to reopen. Before we have experienced a 2-week decline in deaths and cases that is recommended by the CDC, before we have enough tests, we are way behind on having enough testing available for everyone in Georgia. Before many cities, including Macon, have even reached our peak. It feels like he's intentionally putting us into a statewide genocide, opening us all up, exposing our vulnerabilities just in time for the heat of this pandemic. So you can tell that I'm angry. And part of my anger is that I was beginning, maybe, I'm not sure if this is even true, but just beginning to get used to the natural disaster of this COVID-19 and the physical distancing and the online ministry and all of that stuff, and not seeing family and all of that stuff. Just beginning to get used to that. And now this is like another disaster that is spinning me around. That's even more scary and more infuriating than the natural disaster. This human disaster of lack of leadership, of confusing leadership, of feeling like we're not all in this together, and that in fact we're all on our own now. Good luck, coming from our capital. So in a way, I feel like I'm in the wilderness, that I just am so confused. What are the morals instructing our society, instructing our leaders right now? And when I realize this second disaster, this wilderness feeling, it helps me to remember an old story of the Hebrew people, the Israelites' time in their own wilderness, 40 years in the wilderness after they escaped from Egypt, after they escaped captivity and enslavement in Egypt. They too were just as bewildered, just as confused, just as fearful, just as angry as I am. And yet, their time in the wilderness, no matter how filled with suffering and hunger and strife it was a time of forming them as a people. It was a time when they really became the Jewish people. They learned who they were in that struggle. And so when I think about that, coming back to 2019, yeah, it's actually been quite easy for me to be proud of being a UU in these days. Yeah, I value life above the gross domestic product. Woohoo! Yeah, I can set aside my personal preferences to save human lives and life in general. Yay! It's pretty easy to remember why I'm Unitarian Universalist these days. But there's another way that I like to think about it. My colleague Tandy Rogers put a query out on the UU Ministers chat on Facebook, and she asked so she just said, we've had to do swift change, significant change in a very quick amount of time for how you do ministry. And perhaps you experienced some agility in that change. What prepared you to make that change with some agility and grace. And it was really great to read some of the responses from all the ministers. And so I will offer 3. Well, I'll just say that it was, while we're still learning how to do ministry in this pandemic, the actual decision of not meeting on March 15th, of doing Zoom that Sunday, those decisions came fairly easily. And I think that decreased a lot of stress and a lot of confusion for us. And these were part of why it was so easy. Trust. We have a lot of trust at High Street, and that is something to not take for granted. We have a strong sense of responsibility for each other and for those most vulnerable to this disease. And lastly, we believe that we can do hard things together, and we have overcome together those hard things. So those 3 things, even though we might not think of it as preparing, those 3 values were with us before we had to make these decisions, and they helped us to move quickly and with agility and grace. So I hope that this time, although it is filled with fear and anger and confusion and a lot of uncertainty, that we can remember that it is also a time where we remember who we are, where a time of recommitting to our values and acting out our values, and really renewing, which is the theme this month, renewing our faith. It won't hang up. Hang up.